Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Wildlife for Lunch program. Today's topic is predator control, and it is presented by Mike Bodenchuk. He is the State Director for the Texas Cooperative Wildlife Services Program. Today's Wildlife for Lunch is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition, Inc., and is hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. So with that, I'm going to switch over to your program, Mike, and pass the ball over to you. So there you go.
I appreciate it very much. As I was introduced, I am the State Director for the Cooperative Texas Wildlife Services Program. The program does a number of wildlife damage projects in the state of Texas. We keep birds away from airports, we do beaver work, but the majority of our activities involve feral hogs and predator management. Predator management for livestock protection is certainly controversial in some circles, but it's fairly straightforward. Predator management for wildlife is a whole nother ballgame, and I've spent a lot of my career working on predator management strategies to protect wildlife, and that's what we'll be talking about today. While I'm very comfortable with my topic, I probably ought to tell you this is the first webinar I've ever presented, and I am suspect of technology, and so I hope all this works out well. And my first issue is advancing slides. Eleanor, if you can come back on and help me remember how to advance the slides. It's not working for me.
Is it not? There should be the little button up at the top. You should be able to advance the slides by clicking the little arrow. There you go.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hence my suspect of technology. First, I need to put up a disclaimer, and I don't want anybody to come away from this thinking that I am anti-predator. Predation is a naturally occurring event, and over time it shapes both the predator and the prey. The reason mule deer bounce is an anti-predation strategy. Predation should not be eliminated. In some cases, predation can impact the prey that we're interested in below our human objectives. And at those stages, then we need to think about predation management, which may not be the same as predator control. We're not just reducing numbers of predators, but we're reducing the impact of that predation. I'm going to share with you a number of predator-prey relationships, some models that came directly out of a paper done by the late Dr. Warren Ballard on mule deer predation impacts. And all of these models relate to carrying capacity. Carrying capacity in these models is designated by the letter K, or carrying, I suppose, and is a dotted line across the top. The first model we're going to talk about is low-density equilibria, and this model looks like this. These are prey population levels which are flat and restricted by predation. If predation control comes into place, the numbers can increase, but they never increase to that dotted line at the top, the carrying capacity. So food is not going to regulate this. And as soon as you stop predator control, then the population returns to where it is. The second model that we're going to talk about is multiple stable states. And from my perspective, this represents where we are in mule deer numbers across a lot of the West. At low levels, predation is density dependent and it does regulate the population. If you remove that pressure, then the population is going to bounce up there to carrying capacity, and food will regulate the population at the upper level. And so we've got a number of populations where predation is impacting mule deer populations, and we're doing some predation management across the West on that. Both these two models are typical when you have multiple predators and multiple prey. And so these would be systems that have coyotes and lions, and you have mule deer plus other prey for both, and so there's a lot of interdependency there between the multiple predators and the prey systems. The third model that I want to introduce you to is the stable limit cycles, and this is the single predator, single prey example that, frankly, I was taught when I got my wildlife degree. If you think about Canada lynx and snowshoe hares, the prey population cycles independent of predation, and quite frankly, the predators follow this. We used to think that lions, mountain lions and mule deer were on a stable limit cycle, but what we found with some research in the 80s is that when the deer go through their decline, lions are able to switch to other prey, and therefore can exert a higher impact as the deer try to come back. The fourth model is recurrent fluctuations, and that model looks like this one. Again, it looks a lot like the first one, except in recurrent fluctuations, the population will reach carrying capacity. If you keep predator control up, it will crash. This is what happened in the Kaibab. The unknown is where it crashes to. Sometimes it crashes to a population that's higher than the original starting population. Sometimes it crashes to a population that's lower. And that cannot really be predicted. So the recurrent fluctuation can either be a single predator, single prey system, or a multi-predator, multi-prey system. And it was most recently described in moose and wolf populations in the Arctic. I'm going to introduce a couple additional thoughts to you here. Most of what wildlife science has done over the past 30 years is primary predation impact studies. We put radio collars on stuff and we follow them around until they die. We realize that these are studies that basically look at mortality or the single cause of mortality. And there's lots and lots of examples. The very first wildlife monograph that was done by the Wildlife Society was one of these. In primary predation, I want to recognize first that there's positive as well as negative predation effects. Thank goodness something eats feral hogs, or we'd be hip deep in them right now. So those positive effects are out there. When we're talking about effects from here on, I'm probably talking mostly about negative predation effects. Primary effects are those directly related to the act of predation. How many get killed by predators? And our studies used to be designed as primary effect studies, although we didn't use that term. We followed a bunch of deer fawns, and if they starved to death, we said the habitat was lacking. If they were killed by coyotes, then we said that that was a predation impact. And there's lots and lots of these studies out there in the literature. Recently, wildlife biologists have become more and more aware of secondary effects. And these are effects that are caused by changes in prey behavior due to the risk of predation. Secondary effects may mean that elk no longer stand in the meadows, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but instead they stand on a hillside covered in pine trees. They don't get as much groceries, and so they starve to death in winter instead of being killed by wolves. Secondary effects are probably more important than primary effects, but they're very, very difficult to study, and they're very ill-represented in the body of literature. Give you some examples of primary effects. In Strawberry Valley in Utah, we had problems with red fox eating sagegrass. We put 27 radios on female sagegrass to see where they were nesting. Within 12 months, 25 of those 27 were dead. It was all mammalian predation, and we had high densities of red fox. I should point out red fox are invasive in that system. But we had so many red fox there that as they flew away from one, they were effectively flying into the mouth of another. And without doing red fox predation, we could not get our adult survival rates up to where that population was stable. In a northern New Mexico study site in the 70s, I participated in this. Predation by coyotes and cougars ate all of the fawns on a study area. The study area was the Canadian River Gorge outside of Roy, New Mexico. We radio collared 13 does. We captured fawns from every one of those does. And the oldest fawn, the first fawn that was born, was the oldest one at the time of death. He was 42 days old, and predators killed all of them. Again, that was a low-density site. It was paired to a high-density deer site where predators killed the same number, but it was just a fraction of the population because we had a lot more fawns hitting the ground. Black-footed ferrets are endangered species. They live in prairie dog towns. There's been a large effort at captive breeding of black-footed ferrets and releasing them. South Dakota and Montana were the first sites. And without predation management, the ferrets did not do very well. We had 30-day survival rates of about 20 to 30% in those sites. One in South Dakota I remember is 18%. With predator management, with coyote removal immediately prior to black-footed ferret release, we got ferret 30-day survival rates up to about 80%. The final one is cougar predation on transplanted bighorn sheep. In the old days, we used to go out and get 14 to 20 sheep, and we'd put them on a mountain and wish them well. And cougar predation has wiped out a number of those bighorn transplants when we did that. Now we do cougar management or lion management for bighorn protection. We also started transplanting larger groups of sheep. And so if you start with 20 and lions eat 10 of them in a year, you could have a problem. If you start with 40 or 50 and lions eat 10 of them, you're not as bad off. And so you'll see that the strategy for transplants has changed, as well as the need to do predation management. Secondary effects, as I mentioned, Yellowstone, the elk herd, and the introduction of wolves has really brought to the forefront the secondary effects of predator management. We have studied elk and studied wolves and studied elk that are killed by wolves, and the wolves are not eating the elk in Yellowstone to extinction. They are basically chasing them. Elk now are dying in what we used to think of as a pretty mild winter, and it's because they are less fit. The moose herd up there is declining, and the moose are no longer eating a lot of willows. It's because they have to live on the hills instead of in the valley bottoms to escape wolf predation. And so the secondary effects of wolf predation is driven the herd from about 17,000 on the north slope down to about 4,000, and I think it's probably stabilized there. Bighorn sheep in the Sierra Nevadas are also an endangered species, the Sierra Nevada bighorn, and lions were wiping them out. We've done a lot of studies on mountain lions and sheep there, and we found that in the presence of lions, the sheep will not leave the rocks. They stick around the cliffs and forage less effectively. As a result of this, their reproductive rate is lower, their lamb survival is lower, and the population is declined. Not because the lions are eating them, but because the risk of lion predation is driving that population down. Nesting waterfowl at Bear River Refuge was an interesting deal. Bear River Refuge used to produce about 80,000 ducklings. It's the upper edge of the Great Salt Lake. In the 80s, there was a flood that covered the entire refuge, and when the water went down finally, the refuge went in there and built a system of dikes to prevent the refuge from ever going underwater again. When they did that, all the duck nesting habitat became the edge of the dike. And at the same time, invasive red fox and raccoons, which were not native to Utah, came into the system. And one raccoon and one red fox walking that dike can kill can find all the eggs and kill the hens on those nests. And so that linear habitat became a real problem there. The birds quit nesting there. As they came up, they encountered predators. They continued to fly on to other nesting areas. And they went from 80,000 ducklings to 0 ducklings because the risk of predation was so great they just quit nesting. There's some aquatic systems, and aquatic system examples are popular because all the predators and all the prey can be contained in the water. In one case, there was snails that were feeding on aquatic vegetation. The snails would nip the buds on that aquatic vegetation, the terminal buds on that, and keep those plants stunted. Researchers introduced the smell of predator fish to snails into that system. They didn't put any snail predators in the aquarium, but they introduced the smell of snail predators through a system of water. And the snails retreated to the base of the plant. The plants continued to grow and choked out the system. In another system, they actually had algae eaters, and the algae eaters were foraging across a pond. When they introduced predators of those algae eaters, the algae eaters retreated to the banks, and it created an algae bloom that wasn't there. The biomass of algae eaters didn't change, but the foraging behavior of them, they left the open water, and as a result, an algae bloom. Algae bloom is the basic building block of a lot of systems, and so we can see that predation can impact even these very simple systems. Most of our studies look at predators versus prey. I told you about if a fawn dies of starvation, we call it habitat. If it dies of predation, we say that predators are there. If you understand these secondary impacts, as I've talked about, then you could understand why that type of analysis is flawed. Maybe that fawn starved to death because predators kept it from getting to a resource that it needs. And so we've got to change our attitudes about habitat versus predators as a cause of mortality. There's still obviously an interaction between habitat and predation. We'll talk about some more. But these old studies may actually be flawed. And I know I'm poking my finger in the eye of some pretty good scientists. But I believe that the predator habitat analysis that we've done in the past is not correct. On the other hand, where do we put our money? Do we put our money into habitat improvement, or do we put our money into predation management? And I'd like to give you a simple test right here. Habitat improvement is a process. It's not a goal. It's not something that you get done with and never do again. There's always need for habitat improvement. As soon as you turn off a bulldozer, there's going to be some brush that pops up behind you. And so consider habitat improvement something you do for the future. Predation management relates to what you do within the current habitat. If your prey population is well below carrying capacity, it's depressed, then possibly predation management may be able to help you. It'll give you access to existing resources and allow your population to grow to the carrying capacity that's out there now, perhaps. Another scientist and I did a study on predation rates and what affects it, and we published that paper. We categorized about 18 different factors that affect predation rates. Those factors can be grouped into three broad categories: the factors that are related directly to habitat, the factors that are related directly to the predator population, and the ones that are related directly to prey population. I'll have to go through those one of these groups at a time. In habitat factors, there's linear habitat. I talked about the dikes that are in Bear River Refuge. I told the managers of the Bear River Refuge that 80% control of red fox and raccoon may be the same as no control, because the 20% that remains still has access to the duck nests. On the other side of the coin, linear habitat may also be a benefit to the prey. In South Texas, the deer are grazing up and down. Well, they're grazing everywhere. They're browsing everywhere. But predators can only see them when they're in a sendero. If a deer doesn't want to be chased by a sight predator, all he's got to do is actually get out of that linear habitat. So that linear habitat may actually benefit them in escaping. Access to water is another one of the habitat factors. It may be that your habitat's good and you've got all kinds of forage, but if you have limited availability of water, then you're going to increase the interaction between predator and prey at that water site. And we found that to be actually a predator-predator interaction as well, that coyotes kill gray fox when gray fox are at water. When they come out of the rocks and have to go to water, that's when they're vulnerable. The same thing, of course, happens with prey. It's easier for a predator to ambush them. And in some of our bighorn restoration projects, when we put artificial water in there, we basically create a good place for lions to meet sheep. In some cases, with desert bighorns, when we put artificial water in there may not have been enough water to support lions, but the artificial water actually will now allow lions to occupy a mountain range. So access to water is one of those habitat factors. Fire. And fire doesn't burn evenly. Fire burns in a patchwork across a large landscape, and fire may increase predation risk. Certainly predators and prey are concentrated in the habitat that didn't burn. In Nevada, they had 2 million acres of fire one year, and it was all in sagebrush. Well, again, it wasn't even, and the 10 acres of sagebrush that was left was the only place for sage-grouse to hide and the only place for coyotes to forage. And so we saw a huge predation impact following fires when grouse were concentrated with the predators. Excessive cover seems like it wouldn't be a problem, but some prey species like pronghorn detect predators based on visual cues. They look for predators. That's why their eyes are so high on their head. And when brush comes into pronghorn habitat, the pronghorn will actually leave because they can no longer detect predators. We also talk about being able to manage certain species by increasing predation. If you want to increase predation on prairie dogs, for example, you talk about putting hay bales out there that allow coyotes to sneak up behind the hay bale. And so excessive cover can affect predation rates. Drought affects predation rate. The largest single relationship that scientists have found between mule deer survival and anything in the environment is the amount of rainfall that happens. I don't think the prey is dying of thirst out there. What happens is that in a drought, fawns are born lighter than their counterparts that are born in a wet cycle. And so during a drought, those fawns remain vulnerable to predation longer. During a drought, there's a lot less cover for them to hide in, so they're easier for the predators to find. Probably most important, during a drought, there's not a lot of rats and rabbits and cottontails out there, and so the predators that are already on the landscape, that may have grown up in that landscape during a wet cycle, are going to eat something, so they spend more time looking for and finding fawns. Finally, during a drought, females have to spend more time away from their young to get enough groceries for them to survive. And so the relationship between drought and habitat and predation rates is a complex one that may involve some or all of those factors, but it's certainly a well-established relationship. We've put a bunch of artificial perches on the landscape. They're building power lines right now as we speak across Texas, moving wind-generated energy to municipal areas. These provide perches for rafters, and those corridors actually are pretty easy places for raptors to hunt. And so artificial perches or natural perches that are out there also affect the predation rate by raptors. And finally, under the habitat factors, the escape cover, or the amount of escape cover. If a predator can get between the prey and its escape cover, it's got a great chance of getting it. If escape cover is too far from feed, they're not going to go get the feed. The prey won't go get the feed. And so the amount and quality of that escape cover, whether it's cliffs for bighorn sheep or cattails for pheasants or thick brush so deer can escape coyotes, it really affects predation rates. On the predator factors, the populations of predators, obviously the number of predators that are out there is important, but in my opinion, it's probably the least important of these factors. The fixed number of predators that are on a landscape is something. And in these studies where we do predator management, that's what we report. We tell people, well, we think there was 100 coyotes and we killed 60, so we did predator control. While that's obviously one of the factors, it may not be the most important. The social structure of the predators actually is pretty important as well. You may know that coyotes don't breed until their second year. In any given year, 60% of the coyotes on a landscape are non-breeders. In livestock predation, we know that 80% of our lamb losses or calf losses are to coyotes that are raising pups. So the 40% of the population does 80% of the damage. The social structure of foxes, however, is different. Every fox is a breeder before their first birthday. And so foxes on the landscape in March or April are all breeders, whereas coyotes on the landscape are only a small portion of those are breeders. And that makes a difference. Invasive predators obviously can make a difference. There are a ton of examples where the prey species develops an anti-predator defense, but when you put a new predator in the landscape, it doesn't deal with it. And there's a number of species that have gone extinct. I'm thinking of birds in Guam, for example, with the introduction of the brown tree snake. And so invasive predators can have a very disproportionate impact on prey because the prey never evolved a strategy. The territoriality and the degree to which territoriality overlaps is very important. Coyotes are very territorial. Mountain lions, very territorial. And you can only cram so many mountain lions onto a mountain range at any given time. Raccoons, on the other hand, are not territorial. You can have as many raccoons as you have raccoon food. And so if you're looking at something like quail nest protection, for example, and predators may or may not be a factor in that, but the fact that raccoons are not territorial makes predation management very difficult. You can kill one coon, but as long as that's good habitat, two more are going to show up. And so territoriality does affect predation rates in a number of ways. The ability to bridge to alternate prey is another factor of predation rates that's determined by the predators. Some predators are linked to a single prey, Canada lynx and snowshoe hare. When the snowshoe hare go down, the Canada lynx don't have any choice but to either leave or die on their territory. However, coyotes, mountain lions, and a whole host of other common predators can bridge to alternate prey. Those studies that were done in Arizona showed that when deer populations crashed on the north of the Grand Canyon, the lions switched over to eating cattle. And when the lions were eating cattle, their populations did not decline. And therefore, when the deer tried to come back, there were still too many lions out there to allow the herd to increase. And so that bridging to alternate prey affects predation rates in a number of areas. You cannot discount individual behavior as a predation factor. Some lions are very good at eating bighorn sheep, and some lions won't do it at all. In one area where we reintroduced bighorn sheep, we had an adult female that lived on that study site for 2 years. We had every sheep radio collar, and to our knowledge, that female never killed a bighorn. She lived on rabbits, she lived on deer, but she never killed a bighorn. However, the male whose territory overlapped her started eating bighorns almost immediately after they were introduced. And when he removed 3 in a period of about a month, we removed that lion because he was very good. In fact, we never found another kill other than bighorns that lion made. Oddly enough, the lion that replaced him, the male that replaced him, also got very good at killing bighorn sheep. And so this individual behavior, the fact that the males move more than the females, the fact that the males are not trying to protect cubs, makes their individual behavior different than the female that lived in the exact same place. So you can't make a one-size-fits-all discussion about the impact of lions and bighorns. You can say some of them kill them very well, and some of them don't bother them at all. And multiple predator species can impact prey way more than a single predator species at a single stage of life. As an example, the adult red fox that were eating the adult grouse were impacting adult survival. At the same time in that sage grouse population, we had ravens that were eating eggs. And they were keeping the sage grouse nest that did get started from actually being incubated because they kept taking all the eggs. And so in that case, we had ravens working on the egg cycle. There were no grouse growing up. And foxes working on the adult cycle. They were taken off the top end. And that population was crashing before our very eyes. What really struck my attention with this is the relationship between coyotes, mule deer, and mountain lions. Mountain lions eat adult mule deer. They eat bucks in greater percentage than their proportion in the population. That is, if bucks are 20% of a mule deer population, they may be 35 or 40% of the lion's diet. And there's a number of reasons for this. Bucks occur more frequently as singles, so it's easier for a lion to sneak up on a single than on a whole herd. Bucks move more, and so they're easier for lions to detect, and lions move in rougher country where bucks live. The does are in more easily accessible country, which makes it harder for a lion to sneak up on them. However, lions eat does and fawns in relative percentages to their abundance in the population. If you had 100 fawns per 100 does, then the non-buck part of a lion's diet would be half fawns and half does. If you have 50 fawns per 100 does, it would be 1/3 fawns and 2/3 does. What happens if coyotes are working on the fawns when they're first born, and that does happen in a number of places, then there's no fawns left for lions to eat. And essentially, lions must start killing adult does. And lion predation on fawns has got far less of an impact on the population than lion predation on the breeding age animals. If you cut down that adult survival window, then that impacts the population. When we look at what's out there on the landscape, there's a lot more coyotes, a lot more breeding coyotes out there than there are lions. And so in Utah, when we designed a program up there, we actually worked on the coyote side, trying to produce more fawns, which in essence reduced the impact of the lions on the population because there were some fawns for them to eat. By working on coyotes alone, we reduced lion predation on adult does, and we were able to return those populations to healthy numbers. The last of these factors that I want to talk about is prey factors. And certainly the relationship to K, or carrying capacity, is such that you got to pay attention to it. If you are at carrying capacity and you're doing predation management, you're probably not going to increase the size of your population, certainly not for very long. There's one exception to this that I'll talk about in a little bit, but the relationship to carrying capacity is a critical part because eventually the vegetation or the amount of feed out there, which might include artificial feed, supplemental feed that we put out there, but that relationship to carrying capacity is important. The breeding synchrony is my term for how quickly the fawns hit the ground. This is a well-described anti-predator defense for things like wildebeest and everything that eats wildebeest, for caribou and wolves. You try to keep enough bucks out there in the herd or enough rams out there if you're talking about wildebeest, or enough bulls out there if you're talking about caribou, that all the females can be bred in a very short window of time. If all the calves hit the ground in a 3-week window, it's impossible for the number of predators to eat them all. If all the caribou fawns hit the ground in a 3-month period, then the same number of predators may be able to get them all because they're vulnerable for a much longer time. So breeding synchrony relates to buck-doe ratios or bull-cow ratios, and is an important part of the impact of predation. The group size and composition is another one of those. Old age females that lead herds are better at detecting prey or predators than a bunch of yearlings that are out there doing it. And so while we're culling does from whitetail herds, or while we're shooting cow elk out of elk herds, we're also changing some of that age structure out there, and that can have an effect on predation, especially if you're right there on the bubble. So the number of animals that are out there, the age structure, and the size of those herds does affect predation rates. Finally, and this one's important, the amount of alternative prey that's out there. Coyotes, lions, whatever, is going to spend as little energy as possible trying to get their next meal. And if you've got a bunch of cotton rats out there, if you've got a bunch of jackrabbits or a bunch of javelina out there, then they're not going to affect your whitetails or your mule deer or your pronghorns as much because it's easier to catch those. Certainly there's a window of time when they're going to eat pronghorn fawns or mule deer fawns just because that's what's out there. But if you've got alternative prey that's there, that's going to buffer your primary prey or the prey that we're interested in. Well, that's a long, long history on predation impacts and why predators have an impact. Let's talk about what to do with it. First, there are predation management strategies, and I'm not calling this predator control, but how do you impact predation itself? And there are some non-lethal strategies that are available. The first is habitat modification. If you've got linear habitat and you can break that up, that's good. The more edge, the more access that you can give them to escape cover, the better off you are. Increased buck-doe ratios will affect your breeding synchrony. And so if that's the one thing that you think you've got a problem with, if you're seeing fawns dropped early in the season, you're seeing spotted baby fawns 2 months later, you may have an issue with buck-doe ratios and you need to look at that. Non-lethal removal of individual predators, not so much practical unless you're talking about something that's very, very important as a predator. Individual wolves, for example, have been moved to start other populations when wolves are impacting prey. Non-lethal removal doesn't just mean capture and move, however. It may also mean harass them from an area. And as an example, you can harass feral hogs out of an area for 30 or 40 days just by keeping some pressure on them and keeping them off the ground while you've got ground nesting birds in the area nesting may be enough to get those birds off for that short window of time. So when I talk about non-lethal removal, it may be as a result of either capture and move or as a result of harassment. Most of what we do as an agency is selective predator removal. And selective predator removal talks about a specific area, a specific species, and a specific time window. It can address both primary and secondary effects, depends on what you think you've got, but you've got to measure the right things. Again, specific to the species and area, I want to talk about breeding age coyotes in this pasture, which has got my best fawning habitat, or all coyotes during this period of time when we're doing pronghorn restoration. It needs to talk about a specific concern. Neonatal fawn survival is generally what we see when we're talking about deer impacts and coyotes. They're eating them in the first 30 to 45 days of life. But it may also be adult survival if you're talking about lions and bighorns, nest success if you're talking about raccoons and turkeys, or raccoons and quail, or raccoons and any other ground nesting species. So you need to be targeting a specific life cycle stage in your prey as well. For white-tailed deer, we want to remove breeding age coyotes before whelping. If you want a simple thing to remember, the peak of coyote breeding is Valentine's Day. The peak around the middle of February. 63 days later, the middle of April, the peak of whelping. It may be a little earlier, maybe a little later, but it bounces around within that window. If you wait until April or May to remove those coyotes, the females are going to be in the holes with their pups. They're already provisioning those pups, and you'll have a difficult time. If you go out there and kill the male at that time, but don't get the female, you're basically doing the same as no control, because she's still going to provision those pups. So we try and get breeding age coyotes, those coyotes 2 years of age and older, prior to that. If you go out in January and February and you howl like a coyote, or you play a tape of a coyote howling, the only coyotes that are going to answer you are the breeders. The yearlings are not going to want to do that. So if you get them to answer you, and you either go out there and look for them with an aircraft, or you go out there and call to those breeders during that time frame, you're going to be removing the breeding age coyotes. So you can be selective in this. If you miss that window and you've got females in the holes, you can remove pups before fawning. Removing the pups is not pleasant. They didn't do anything wrong, but removing those pups instantly turns off the urge for them to kill. And so we find that livestock losses cease completely within 1 day of removing a litter of pups, even if you don't remove the adults. And removing pups is the driving, or the pups are the driving force for the predation on fawns, and the adults will quit doing that and go back to eating rats and mice almost immediately. You want to focus on the areas of contact, your fawning habitat, your water sources, any of those areas that are being well utilized. Sometimes if you do this in advance, what you'll find is if you remove the adult coyotes in that area, the deer will shift their use over there to fawn. They detect those predators on a daily basis, and they can find the hole in the habitat where it's safe for them to fawn. And aerial control, again, most effective before April 1st. Even though your fawns are going to come a couple months later, your best bet is to get those breeding age coyotes before April 1. Earlier I mentioned there is an exception to carrying capacity, and that's for high fenced operators who are managing intensively for genetics. There's a lot of work around the antler characteristics being passed on, and from my perspective, the things that I have read, I know that the calcium that goes into antlers comes from the long bones. The first deer fawns, the first male deer fawns that hit the ground have got the best chance of getting a big body frame. They've got the best chance of growing to their genetic potential. They're also the most vulnerable to coyote predation because they're out there in a window when there aren't any other fawns. And so for those people that are high fenced, that may be at carrying capacity, you may still want to consider doing predator management or predation management to protect your investment in those genetics. In essence, you're making the decision about the genetics rather than letting the coyotes make the decision. Obviously, this comes with additional responsibilities. For every buck fawn you're saving, you're probably saving a doe fawn out there, and it means the cost of culling those doe fawns is going to go up as well. So if you start down this road at carrying capacity, realize that you've got a big management investment associated with it. For mule deer, again, we want to remove breeding coyotes prior to whelping, and in mule deer habitat, that may be restricted at certain elevations. Deer like to go to riparian corridors. They like to go to those valley or canyon bottoms where there's some good green forbs that are growing during that time frame. And so you've got to look for those fawning areas and work on those coyotes whose territory overlap those fawning areas. Access to water in Texas mule deer country is critical, and so any coyotes that are coming into water holes may have a secondary impact, and certainly if they're killing fawns there, they're having a primary impact. And so look at your water holes and work on coyotes that are coming to those. Dr. Ballard's paper suggested that 70% removal rate was necessary to increase deer numbers, and for research that was done, that is about what it looked like. I'm going to suggest that 70% removal is not necessary if you're selective to the breeding age coyotes. If you're just going to go out there and do generic coyote control, kill anything that looks like a coyote, then you're probably going to have to take 70% or more of your population to get those breeders. But if you concentrate on breeders, you can do a pretty good job. And all of these strategies are related to neonatal fawn survival, that first 30 to 45 days. That's when you're trying to get it. If you've got coyotes eating adults or lions eating adults, then you've got a different strategy you've got to consider. In those cases, or in the case of drought, and it seems like we're always in a drought, reducing overall coyote numbers may be important. In a drought, those deer have got to forage much farther out there, and you may be seeing secondary effects, especially in drought years. And so when it's dry, removing coyotes as a general rule, rather than just those selected coyotes, may be necessary to get the full benefit of it. If you're going to try that strategy, then you need to monitor your overall numbers rather than just neonatal fawn survival. In a drought, they may be killing adult deer just as fast as they're killing fawns, and you're not going to detect that with a doe-fawn ratio. And so you need to be talking total numbers, count the whole herd, and monitor that. So for pronghorn are very easy to protect. All of the studies that have been done on pronghorn protection have shown that you can double survival of fawns up to about 1 fawn per doe. You can't get it much higher than that. There's natural factors that work into that. But if you hadn't done any predator management and you were at 30 fawns per 100 does, you might be able to do predator management and get it up to 60 fawns per 100 does. That may not be where you want, but that's about what you can get is double. Removing your breeding coyotes prior to whelping. And again, aerial is very good for this. Continue those efforts through fawning season. New coyotes will come into that area. They probably won't breed that year because their breeding structure is already established, but you can continue to do fawn protection by removing those through the fawn drop. If you're going to do a relocation, we look at the 30-day survival rate, and you want to protect adult pronghorn for 30 days after relocation simply because they're stressed and they're in new country. And for ground nesting birds, again, I want to have a disclaimer in here. All ground nesting bird mortality essentially is predation. They don't run out of teeth and starve to death. They might get hit by a car, but essentially upland bird mortality is predation. And it's completely natural. You're not going to change that. There's hawks out there you can't work on. A whole lot of other predators that work on them. Predator management is necessary for reintroduction. Atwater prairie chickens, populations of birds that are in jeopardy. And it may be necessary to protect nesting habitat. These birds are picking their nesting habitat based on predation risk. And they may not be picking the best habitat for rearing chicks. They may be picking it based on where they can hide from the raccoon or the fox or the coyote. And so secondary effects may be dealt with habitat selection. You need to do this intensively. Prior to predation happening is a poor time to initiate it. Start when the birds first start calling, when your quail are calling, when the turkeys are gobbling. Make sure that you got those predators out of there as the hens pick their nest sites. I think that's where we're going to quit. We've got some time for questions. My contact information's up there. If I can help either now through the question period or later on, please feel free to give me an email or a call. I think, how are we going to handle the questions?
Yeah, if you guys have any questions, if you could please post them in the chat window to all participants, and I will relay those questions to you as they come in. So we don't have any just yet, but if you do have any questions, then yeah, please go ahead and type them in that chat window. And thank you so much for coming and helping us out today with this presentation. Hopefully we'll have some questions. Let's see. Okay, here's a question. So this question is, we have 240 acres of not high fenced, fenced/unfenced land in our community, 20 different lots under a wildlife management plan, and there are 2 herds of deer, white-tailed deer. and there's about 30 to 40 axis, 30 to 40 whitetail and 45 to 60 axis deer. So what's a good number for management of each species?
Well, I'm going to probably have to punt on this question. The number of deer that are out there has got a lot to do with where you are, how much forage is growing. I would suggest if you're against the Louisiana state line, that's not too many deer because they get 50, 60 inches of rain. If you're in Rock Springs, that's probably too many deer already for 240 acres. And you're probably seeing some competition. Your local Parks and Wildlife biologist is going to be the best one to tell you what the suggested carrying capacity is for your area. And I'd suggest you contact them because, as I noted, there's a wide difference across the state of Texas.
All right. So please, if you guys have any questions, continue to post them in the chat window to all participants. I notice somebody has their hand raised. So as I said, if you have a question, then please post that in the chat window. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these webinars will be placed up on our website. I will try to get this one up next week, and I will post a link to our website here in the chat window as well. Okay, here we go. Here's another question. Are armadillos considered predators?
You know, there have been some studies that show armadillos disrupting quail nests. I would suggest that they're not an effective predator of quail. I've seen pictures of elk eating eggs. I've seen pictures of white-tailed deer eating eggs. This is a popular topic for wildlife biologists to put little micro cameras on a nest and see what happens to it. While it may happen out there on the landscape, if you know anything about armadillos, they've got very, very rudimentary teeth structure. They're primarily an insectivore, and I would not consider them an effective predator. Does it mean they don't get a nest every once in a while? No, they will every once in a while, but I don't think they even go looking for them.
All right. The next question, what is the impact of wild hogs on nesting turkeys and fawn survival?
We don't know. I was involved in a project in Bandera County where the fawn to doe ratio was 3 fawns per 100 does. 14,000 acres at a total of 14 cows on the place. A lot of forage, a lot of good habitat, and the herd was just sinking. I don't know that the hogs are eating them to death, but hogs do carry a virus called pseudorabies. The pseudorabies virus is fatal to other wildlife. And if you understand how it works, if a deer fawn gets pseudorabies from a hog, it's going to die. And the hogs are going to find it as soon as it starts to smell and eat it. So there is very little evidence of a pseudorabies outbreak. We were never able to put our finger on it and say that's what killed the fawns on this place. But I don't think even coyotes and mountain lions combined can drive fawns to 3 per 100. I suspect there's some disease impacts as well. For ground nesting birds, obviously hogs are an effective predator of anything that nests on the ground. And we're doing a study this spring. There's a new technology that will give us the DNA profile of everything that's in a hog's stomach. So we're going to good nesting habitat. We're collecting a small handful of hog stomachs and running them through the analysis to see what kind of eggs might be in there, what kind of species might be present. And from my perspective, also the herps, the snakes and amphibians that are out there. I worry with our high hog abundance that we have problems with species going on the endangered species list because of hog predation. So we're trying to get a handle on that right now, but I don't know that we can quantify it, but you got to guess that they're having some impact.
All right. Our next question is, do raccoons have any predators other than coyotes?
Well, baby raccoons would have other predators, including hogs or anything else that can get to them. And if you've ever been around a female with small young, they're very protective of them. However, they outgrow that window very quickly. That's why they're so successful. They don't remain vulnerable very long, and they can basically breed up to whatever the capacity of that land is. So coyotes don't even really regulate populations. There's certainly some raccoons that get killed by coyotes. Sometimes it's a territorial defense, and they don't even eat the raccoon at the time. Other times it's not. What regulates raccoon populations more than anything are diseases, and we have had a couple of outbreaks in the last 3 years of canine distemper in raccoons, widespread distemper outbreaks that are knocking the raccoon populations back. And it does so in a very quick period of time. You'll go from seeing, one roadkill to every 5 miles to seeing no roadkills at all. And that's usually what happens when a distemper outbreak occurs.
All right. We have a question just again about wild turkeys. I don't believe this is related to wild hogs as the last one is. So just what about wild turkeys? Is there anything different you would do with them?
Well, again, you understand how turkeys, and if you're a turkey hunter, you understand this, but how turkeys construct a nest. They don't go lay 12 eggs or 14 eggs all at once. They lay 1 egg today. And they cover that with grass, and they go back to the roost, and the next morning they come off the roost, and they go out there and they lay another egg tomorrow. And then they lay a 3rd egg the 3rd day until their body tells them that they've reached their capacity, and then they start to incubate all the eggs at once. Much of the egg nest predation that we suspect happens before the hen ever starts brooding that nest, before she ever locates on that nest and starts incubating. So she lays 1 egg today and she walks away, and a raccoon comes along tonight and finds that egg, eats that egg. Tomorrow when she comes back and it's gone, she's going to go try and find another place to lay. And if she lays there and another predator gets that egg, then she's going to try and find a 3rd place. All of our studies are based on what happens to the nest after she sits on it. But most of the nest predation, or most of the egg predation, occurs prior to her even localizing on that nest. So it's not special about turkeys than any other ground nesting bird or any other determinate layer, but you have to understand predation is occurring even before she starts sitting on that nest.
All right. Our next question, there's a lot of discussion on coyotes and lions on white-tailed deer, mule deer, and pronghorn, but has there been any studies looking at the effect of these species on bobcats? And kind of a follow-up to that, what would be the best way to manage bobcats?
Bobcats are a very, very important predator of pronghorn, oddly enough, and if you look at the country that pronghorn live in West Texas, you wonder what they're hiding behind. The bobcats can be very effective on pronghorn fawns. Bobcats, like lions, are a sight predator. They go around the country looking for things, and pronghorns being out in the open make them much more vulnerable. Bobcats will kill adult deer on an occasional basis. They certainly kill fawns. But being a sight predator, about the time that fawn gets up and is able to run, he's also able to outrun a bobcat. And so there's conflict at water holes, there's conflict a little bit. But bobcats don't impact deer fawns as much as they might pronghorns. Bobcats are easily trapped. Once you find out where a bobcat is watering, once you find out where they're hunting, a good bobcat trapper can catch cats. And with prices as high as they are, there's concern that bobcats may be overexploited. Bobcat populations fluctuate up and down with rabbit populations. And so, in a wet year, when you don't have the predation impacts, that's when you get a lot of bobcat kittens to survive. As the drought kicks in, that's when you want to consider doing bobcat control with traps, again, in that winter to spring period of time, and bobcats can be easily controlled with traps. Selectively, I would look at the adult bobcats. Obviously, the bigger cats are the ones that are doing most of that, and the bigger males are the ones that do that. Males move a lot in January because of breeding, and so that's the easiest time to target adult male bobcats.
All right, we have another question about bobcats. Are they a major factor on turkeys? And I believe you've already covered that they don't affect fawns very much, but are they a major factor on turkeys?
Again, they are a sight predator, and turkeys walk around in the daytime. Bobcats kind of walk around at night. And so where they intersect, where they interact, they're certainly going to kill them. But I don't think they're a major impact on turkeys, with a possible exception of very, very low densities of turkeys. As we watch our eastern turkey populations tipping over and becoming low densities, there may be a lot more opportunity for bobcats to impact turkeys at low densities. But if you're thinking traditional Rio Grande country, I don't believe they're a big issue.
All right, next question is about beavers. It says they're destroying many of the cypress trees along the river. Can they be removed? Can they be shot?
Beavers can be shot if they're doing damage, and you need to talk to Parks and Wildlife about the legal implications of that. But I can tell you that as a fur bearer, if they are doing damage, you can shoot them out of the fur season, and as long as you don't possess them, toss them away, you're okay. I would suggest, however, that what you may want to look at is if it's truly beavers or if it's nutria. Beavers cut trees down, and nutria girdle trees by peeling the bark away. They chew on that to get at the cambium underneath. Most of the damage I've seen to cypress trees has actually been nutria, and I cannot remember a cypress tree cut down by beavers. Tupelo trees, yes, but cypress trees, I can't recall one. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but if you're seeing the bark chipped off and not the tree actually being cut, it may well be nutria as well.
All right. Yeah, she says that they have both and have already been controlling the nutria. So.
Yeah. But again, nutria are an invasive species. They don't do the damage here like they do in the floating marsh country in Louisiana, but they're certainly competing with other species out there, and they do harbor a couple of diseases. So we do recommend control on nutria.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions right now, so please, if you have any more questions, well, please post them. Oh, here's one. Somebody said, just a comment, they had a problem in 2011 with porcupines killing big Spanish oaks and pecans.
Yeah, porcupines live in the trees. They will chew on the bark, get to the cambium underneath, and especially with oaks, that's a great way for oak wilt to be introduced into that tree. The good news is porcupines, there aren't many of them out there, and even when there's a lot of damage, it's usually just a couple porcupines, and they can be managed fairly easily. Porcupines, because of their goofy diet, are salt crazy, and so a live trap that's baited with like a salt block that's designed for rabbits or guinea pigs, you can catch a porcupine in a heartbeat. They really crave salt. We've also taken water softener salt and sprinkled it around and get them used to it, and then you can get them in a cage with water softener salt. So porcupines are easily managed, but they can do a lot of damage.
All right, we have another question. What species are affected by red or gray fox?
Gray fox are probably as innocuous as any predator that's out there, except maybe the ringtail. They don't eat a lot of the major game that we manage for. They can impact quail populations at high densities. Generally, gray fox populations are in inverse relationship to coyotes. Where you have a lot of coyotes, you don't have many grays, and where you have a lot of grays, you don't have many coyotes. I think gray fox probably do a pretty good number on blue quail out in far west Texas, but they don't impact a lot of the wildlife that we tend to manage for. Obviously, they're eating something out there, and it's songbirds, it's lizards, it's rats and mice, and those kind of things. Red fox are a little different. Red fox are capable of pulling down some larger prey. I think that turkeys would be vulnerable, quail would be vulnerable. And red fox will cover the landscape differently than grays. Grays tend to stay in the thicker brush and the oaks, where red fox will get out in the open as long as there's not coyotes. And so you'll see the potential for quail impacts, and again, these might be secondary impacts. They're running the quail off of that nest, and so she goes someplace less attractive to try and nest. But you can see that with reds. There was a study done at Texas Tech sometime back that looked at some DNA, and a lot of the red fox that we have are not a native red fox. There was even a 1942 publication by none other than Aldo Leopold that showed the march of red fox across the Great Lakes state. And so what we're seeing is a lot of European red fox that are coming in and taking over a niche that was occupied earlier by grays, or living side by side with coyotes and just splitting up the landscape differently. They do impact, both species could impact nesting waterfowl. We don't have a lot of waterfowl nesting, but nesting waterfowl and shorebirds can be impacted by foxes.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so if you have any, someone just asks, do the questions and answers show up in the archives for the webinars? This chat panel will show up on the webinar. It'll show up much like this. I'll remove the participants panel, but the chat panel will be visible, so you should be able to see the questions, and they will be part of the recording. So, yeah, all of this will be recorded, so you should be able to hear it for the archived versions of the webinars. So if there's not any questions, I want to thank you again, Mike, for coming and doing this presentation for us. And our next Wildlife for Lunch webinar will be on June 20th. It's going to be over small acreage wildlife management, and Rufus Stevens will be presenting that one. So with that, I think that's the end of our program. So thank you guys all for joining us at lunch today, and thank you again, Mike, for that great presentation.
Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.